It is over. Let's get started. Thanks everyone for joining us today to this webinar about S/4HANA lessons learned, best practice approach to migrating your security concept from ECC to S4. Before we start, a couple of housekeeping questions, and then we'll do the introductions real quick. There is a questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel. So if you have any questions, if anything that I or we say or show doesn't make sense, feel free to type in your question. We'll monitor that questions box. We try to reply as we see those questions come in. And then at the end, we read out some of those questions and obviously also the answers. For any questions that we can't get to because we run out of time, we'll send out an email in the next couple of days with an answer to every question that we've gotten. Obviously anonymized, so no names, etc. So feel free, don't be shy. Send us your questions and we'll answer them one way or the other. This is also being recorded, so you will get an email or maybe even 2 or 3 from GoToWebinar. And also I send out one as well to links to the recording. There is a player that GoToWebinar offers. I'm not exactly sure, I've never used that, but I'll also upload the session to YouTube and then I'll send you a link to the YouTube if that's your preferred way of watching it or rewatching it or sharing it with someone else if you like. With that said, I think we can do a quick round of intros. You might have seen Jeff Porter and his face on the intro slide. He is not presenting today. I simply forgot to update that slide. It was supposed to be Alessandro Banzer and me doing the presentation today. However, bad news for everyone trying to hear Alessandro. It's mostly going to be me talking. An hour ago, he sent me his slides and said, hey, I wouldn't mind if you talked about them, so I can do other stuff. I hope by other he means watching the questions box and answering the questions and not answering emails. But anyway, it's gonna be mostly me doing the talking today. Alessandro is on the call if you want to say hi to answer any to answer any technical questions or anything that I might not be able to answer. So with that said, let's get started with a quick agenda. So I'll very briefly tell you about Xiting. Most of you likely know who we are, what we do. I see a number of familiar names on the attendee list, and I know some of you have seen this presentation or a version thereof before, so that either means that S/4HANA is an incredibly hot topic right now and you can't get enough of it, or you just love to hear my voice. Either way, I appreciate you being here. Then we talk about what's new in S4, just to make sure we're all on the same page. We talk a couple of new things that you might want to consider, and then we dive right into the security aspect, some of the best practices. I'm going to show you a slide-based demo on how you can lift and shift your security from ECC to S4, regardless of if you do a brown field, green field, blue field, or whatever color is next type of migration. We can cover that. We talk about lessons learned, some of the lessons that we've learned and our customers have learned by moving to S4. And then we'll open it up to questions. Again, if you have any questions, anything that doesn't make sense, anything you would like to know, drop us your question in the questions box, and we'll try to answer them as we go. Alrighty, just a few words about Xiting. We were founded in 2008 by SAP security experts, headquartered in Switzerland. We have obviously still offices in Switzerland, Germany, England, Romania, and here in the US, we are based out of Tampa, Florida. That's where Alessandro is from. I'm based out of Atlanta. We have a very close relationship with SAP Education, so we deliver and develop some of the training classes around S4 security and authorization management in general through SAP. So if you go to trainingsap.com, you might find some of the courses that we deliver. Alessandro is actually one of the trainers as well, doing the ADM 945 and others. So with that said, let's take a look at what's new in S4 to make sure we're all on the same page and we understand what it is and what it isn't. Obviously, S4 is an entirely new product line. It's going to be the center of all of our future data world, unless you can strong arm SAP in extending your maintenance beyond 2025. That's where your legacy business suite is going out of maintenance. And so SAP would like everyone by that time to be on S4. If that's going to happen or not, we shall see. There are still a number of holdouts, I have learned, that haven't even thought about moving to S4 yet. So we'll see how that goes. But one of the things that SAP has done is they've changed the data model in architecture. Many things remain the same. It's still an ABAP-based application server, but the data model, the underlying data model has changed. Obviously, the database is now HANA. There is no Oracle or Microsoft SQL Server with S4. Wouldn't make sense. And what SAP has really tried is to find and to offer one solution for each requirement. And with that comes a reduction of applications and transactions. And if you've built roles before, you know that, transactions, you'll find transactions in roles. So if transactions have gone away, have changed, have been made obsolete or replaced with new transactions, and that means it impacts your roles. And to give you one example of that consolidation and reduction, we see here the process of registering a vendor invoice that today or in your legacy business suite, you can either do in MM or in FI. So there are two separate modules that allow you to perform pretty much the same task. In S4, SAP has consolidated that capability into what they call invoice management. So there's only one way of doing things, at least that's the goal. And overall, that is a good thing, because why have redundant capabilities for the same thing, right? It makes everything easier. It makes your training easier. It makes it easier for end users and for business users to understand how things work. But it also means it's going to change the way you authorize your users, because there are business processes that have to change, and there are a ton of transactions that are going away. And so the key takeaway, if you don't remember anything else from this presentation, is that the path to S4 is not a direct upgrade. And it doesn't really make a huge difference if you do a brown, blue, or greenfield implementation. And I think SAP is now pushing more towards greenfield instead of moving over all your legacy and 50-year-old data. But regardless, it's not a simple upgrade. It's not something like installing an enhancement pack. It's a little bit more involved, and it definitely has a significant impact on your overall security, and that's something to take into account. And what that means is, from a planning perspective and project management perspective, that it becomes important to involve the security team from the beginning and to give them a chance to estimate the effort it takes to update your security as part of that S4 migration. If you disregard that, and if you ignore the fact that security is will have an impact, then you might end up with a derailed or delayed project if halfway into the project you figure out that you haven't done any security work yet and that you have to update thousands of roles. That's obviously not a spot you want to be in, and however, a spot that some of our customers have found themselves in. There is one example, I've mentioned this just, I think, last week at the ASAC meeting, where a customer called us in November of last year saying that they are 1 month out of starting acceptance testing as part of their S4 migration project, and they just realized that they have to change all their roles and authorizations. And that's not a spot that you want to be in. You want to make sure everyone understands from the beginning, moving to S4 means doing security work, but either designing new roles or redesigning your old ones or lift and shifting your old ones. It doesn't really matter. There is going to be work to be done. From an architecture perspective, there are 3 core areas where we have seen changes that S4 introduces. We already talked about changed functions and new functions in terms of applications and transactions. There is also, could be also an impact on system architecture, simply because the consolidation is not limited to individual transactions and applications, but also to modules. And then there are new user interfaces that, such as Fiori and UI5, that you might or might not be leveraging today already. If not, then that's something new that your users have to get familiar with, and from a security perspective, that you have to properly authorize. Let's first take a look on the impact on system architecture real quick. So when you deploy S4, what you get is what's called an S4HANA core. It's a core stack of modules, if you will. And one thing on the bottom here, in bold that sticks out a little bit is HCM, or Human Capital Management, because traditionally an HR system is often on a dedicated landscape or system, simply because if you want to install updates due to change tax laws, etc., it's much easier to do that on a dedicated box without impacting the rest of your ECC system. With S4, you get HCM as part of the core stack. Now that means you can still run it on a HCM on a dedicated system, but it comes with everything else as well that you can obviously choose not to use. From a cloud perspective, there are also a lot of improved and new integration scenarios with SAP's cloud solutions, be it SuccessFactors or Ariba or Hybris and any of the ones that you can see here on the right. One thing that we have seen is that a cloud solution doesn't always, or in most cases, replace an on-prem solution. For instance, SuccessFactors does not yet, or maybe never will, replace an on-prem HCM system. The cloud solution is great for certain use cases, like doing your expense reporting and what have you, stuff that's end user facing. But when it comes to running core processes of your business, chances are you'll end up with an on-prem solution potentially connected to the cloud, and you'll basically end up with a hybrid scenario. You might end up with a hybrid scenario. From a new and changed function perspective, I already showed you one example before on the initial slide. Here are two more examples. One is a consolidation of transactions. So MIGO, a transaction, replaces a number of legacy transactions. So if you have any roles or authorizations that authorize users for MB31, for instance, on ECC, once you move to S4, you have to authorize them for MIGO. And obviously MIGO comes with a new set of authorization objects that you have to take into account. From a module perspective or application perspective, we can see that MM, SLC, and SRM have been consolidated into sourcing and procurement, or S procurement in short. And that gives you already an idea of how S4 might potentially impact your system architecture if you have any of these modules on dedicated landscapes or in dedicated landscapes. There is also a new general ledger that you have to activate. That's, in fact, there are a number of steps that lead up to that migration that you have to think about and implement before you can even start your journey towards S4. So if you haven't started yet, if you haven't even thought about moving to S4 yet, then if nothing else, I would highly recommend you look at what's required before you can even start. There is also new cache management and new output management, just to give you a couple of more examples. From a security perspective, customer and vendor integration is mandatory on S4 through the business partner concept. There is also a not new, but a newer transaction, BP, that we'll see throughout this presentation over and over again. And what that means from a practical perspective is that any roles with customer, vendor, and other master data transactions need to be updated. So you need to go, and I'll show you a screenshot here in a bit that shows all the legacy transactions that are being replaced by BP. And that's quite a few, it's a few dozen. So any roles that have those old legacy transactions in there, you have to touch, you have to remove them, you have to put in BP, you have to do an SU24 update, etc., to make those roles compatible with S4. There are also new transactions and authorization objects. Obviously, there are OData services to authorize and to take into account. In particular, if you decide to go with Fiori and you have front-end authorizations to worry about, back-end authorizations, and those OData services in between, a couple of layers or additional layers of complexity that you will have to take into account from a security perspective. There are also obsolete functions. SAP has removed a number of things, and in some cases there are replacements, in other cases there are not, and in yet other cases there is capability that has become obsolete, like the Utilities Customer Electronic Services, or UCES, that SAP then later reintroduced under a different name. And so the point here really is, take a look at what has gone away, make sure it doesn't impact or it's not part of your existing business processes, and if so, is there a replacement or an alternative way of doing things? And if not, what do you gotta do? something to keep in mind. New user interfaces. Fiori is you obviously can use Fiori on a non-S4 system, but with S4, Fiori certainly takes center stage. It's significantly prettier than what you or your business users might be used to from legacy web UIs or even from SAP GUI, or in particular from SAP GUI. So it looks very nice, it's very slick, it's very user-friendly, and I'm sure most of your users are going to appreciate the UI that Fiori and SAP delivers with Fiori. And this is a screenshot of how it looks like, on a Mac, it looks like in this case, or on a computer, or PC, laptop, whatever, and then on mobile. It's very mobile friendly. It doesn't matter what screen size, etc. you have. It always looks good. So that's the good news. Legacy applications still work. SAP GUI still works as well with S4. S4 is nothing than an ABAP stack at the end of the day, so you can continue using S4 SAP GUI, and it's even necessary in some cases because there isn't a Fiori app for every single backend transaction. Generally speaking, as far as Fiori and UI5 apps are concerned, there are different types of apps that SAP has made available and that you can develop, be it transactional apps, analytical and fact sheets type of apps. But you definitely need to take into account the authorizations that are required by the underlying OData services. And we'll show you how that works and how that goes together here in a couple of slides. Before we get there, let's take a look at the security aspect of S4. We've now concluded the overview, so we're all on the same page in terms of what S4 is and what it isn't, hopefully, at least to the extent that we need to know when we talk about security. The good news is the way you do security with S4 is exactly the same as on a legacy ECC system. And that is because we are still dealing with an ABAP stack, with an underlying database and the application server connects to the database with a technical account. So none of that has changed. That means we still have ABAP authorizations to deal with that we can maintain in PFCG in the profile generator. We can still use SU01 for user data maintenance. All of that is exactly the same. The big thing that has changed is the data model. And because of that data model, that underlying data model that has changed, we, or you in that case, whoever is moving to S4, needs to do at least a partial role redesign. And a good question that I often get is, well, should we do a role redesign before embarking on our journey, or should we do it as part of the S4 migration project? And there are different trains of thought, and our recommendation is that if your existing security concept is not in good shape, and that means you've built roles not based on best practice, so by not leveraging SU24, SAP's authorizations proposals database. If you do not have clean and SOD-free single roles, but instead you might be using composites, or maybe worst case scenario, enabler roles or value roles. I know they are super popular among some of the larger integrators, but moving to S4 perspective, they can really hurt you. In terms of what it takes to move that stuff over and to test it properly. So if you suspect that your role design is not in great shape, then our recommendation would be to clean it up front, get it as close to SAP standard and best practice as possible, because the actual lift and shift, meaning replacing transactions and making those roles then compatible to S4, is significantly easier in comparison to a full redesign. However, in some other cases, if you say, what, we are starting with the S4 migration right now and we don't have time to do a redesign and wait, then you have to do it as part of the S4 migration. Just make sure you plan and set aside enough time to get that done and to do it right. This is an opportunity for you to do it right instead of lifting and shifting your crappy security concept. So that's kind of how we see it. Now, SAP is a Fiori app catalog that gives you indication of a number of things. First of all, it shows you what Fiori apps are available and what OData services you need for those, and also to what extent a Fiori app replaces a backend transaction. Because it's not always that a Fiori app completely replaces a backend transaction. That's not the case. So for some of your users, they might end up switching back and forth between Fiori and SAP GUI if the Fiori app doesn't provide proper coverage. And here is another screenshot that shows, SAP calls it relevance, but that's basically an indication, a 3-point system, 1, 2, or 3, that tells you how relevant a Fiori app is to a backend transaction. And you can export that obviously to Excel. There is another tiny screenshot on the bottom that shows you, for instance, the Fiori app F0017 replaces pretty much entirely transaction VA03. So if you see that, then that means, okay, for users that are used to using VA03, they can use that Fiori app. In other cases, if the relevance is 2 or even 1, that may mean they can maybe do some of those things in Fiori, but not everything. And so that's important for you to understand how much Fiori you can use, or your users can use, and where you need your SAP GUI, for instance, or legacy web UIs. Also important from a security perspective, again, looking at those OData services to figure out how you have to authorize those Fiori apps. Because if you look at the stack, so to say, there is the Fiori Launchpad, there is a web dispatcher, there's the front-end server, and there is the back-end server. And there are different types of authorizations to take into account. So the front-end authorizations determine what a user, meaning what tiles and Fiori apps a user can see when they log in to the Launchpad. So that's the first set of authorizations that kicks in and says, okay, what can that user even see? Or what apps does the user have access to? Once that is taken care of, and once the user launches one of those Fiori apps, a second set of backend authorizations, and again, there are those OData services in between that connect basically the front end with the backend, then the backend determines what a user can do with those apps. Can they only read data? Can they update, delete, etc., etc.? So it's a potentially second layer of authorizations to take into account, and a layer that, unless you've used Fiori before, you might not be familiar with. And again, something to read up upon and make sure you understand how that works. Here is another more complex, we don't go into the details here, but it's basically, again, a diagram that shows you with the Launchpad, you have tiles and groups of tiles, and then you have the front-end server, and how all of that basically works together. And then at the bottom here, you see the OData service, and then it makes the call back to the ABAP system. And so these are all PFCG roles, basically, that you have to maintain, you have to design, and you have to properly authorize your users for. To help with all of that, SAP was kind enough to publish what they call a simplification list. The simplification list basically gives you information about all of those changes. And while it might be a simple list, it's a very long list, an extensive list. You can see here the evolution in terms of page count from S4 1610 to 1709 and 1809, and I suspect that with 1909 it's going to be even more pages. So just thinking about the time it takes to look at the simplification list and comparing the changes proposed by SAP in that simplification list and comparing that with your hundreds or thousands of roles. I mean, if you have any hundreds of roles, I think you're in pretty good shape. Most larger customers have thousands of roles. There are even some that have more roles than users, which is crazy. But that's beside the point. The point is that comparing simplification list with your roles and authorizations can be a very time-consuming process, only to find out what needs to change. Now, true, there is a transaction in SAP called SU25, and SU25 gives you a partial insight into how many of your roles are affected. The bad news is that out of the 5,500 or so authorization objects, that have changed with S4, SU25 only knows about 3,500. So it's an incomplete list, but at least it's a partial glimpse into what you need to change. Now with SU25, you cannot make those changes, meaning you cannot update your roles. You cannot remove a T code and put in another one. That's not how it works, unfortunately. But at least you can see, based on the 3,500 that SAP knows, what you need to change. And it's likely going to be a huge effort and something that you want to plan for. Here is one example, I've mentioned it initially, about BP, the business partner transaction, and all of the legacy transactions that it replaces. So that's quite an extensive list, and that's only one of the simplifications. So if you have any of these transactions, FD0, 1, 2, 3, whatever, in your existing roles, then you have to basically take that legacy transaction out and put in BP. And with BP, since it's such a powerful transaction, replacing so many different legacy transactions, it comes with extensive authorization objects that you have to take into account, populate, and hopefully do it the right way by leveraging SU24 and other best practice means. And that way, lift and shift your roles. So that's quite a bit of legwork if you do it manually. Now, let's talk about some of the best practices that we've seen and that we think you should take into account. And one is, I've mentioned it already, analyze your security concept so you know where you stand. Understand what type of role concept you're using. Are you using job-based roles, task-based roles, single roles, composites, derived, enabler, whatever the concept might be and the ideology might be, understand what you have and what the pros and cons are, not only from an SAP best practice perspective, but also from an S4 migration perspective. Then involve your leadership and make sure that at least the project management team fully understands the impact of a migration on your security and that you need to carve out time to get your security concept up to speed and up to par with S4 and make it S4 compatible. And obviously make that part of the whole planning process. Then streamline your security, especially if you're in bad shape. If you have not maintained SU24 in the last 20 years, this is an opportunity to do it, to get on the right track, to do it based on best practice and to do it right. And I know, depending on how many of you are in security, you might or might not have heard of SU24. If you have heard about it, you might not have used it before, but it's such a crucial and fundamental tool in SAP security that we highly encourage you to do that. And I've briefly mentioned it before, SU24 is SAP's authorizations proposals database. And without going into the weeds, just to give you one example, if I'm a security admin and someone tells you, hey, give me SU01D so I can display user data, then what I can do is I can go into PFCG, the profile generator, and I can add the SU01D to the role menu. Adding transactions to the role menu is another best practice way of doing it instead of adding those objects manually. So if I add it to the role menu, then PFCG basically looks at SU24 and says, hey, do you have a proposal for this transaction? And if so, give it to me so I can include it with the role. And for SU01D, the obvious proposal that makes sense is activity 03. Display access, because I want to display user data. So if that proposal is in SU24, I can get it automatically into my role without having to insert it manually, which gives me a number of advantages, the most important one being maintainability and transparency of that role in the long run. Because if at some point, 2 years down the line, someone tells me, hey, remove SU01D again, please. If I take that out, then the activity field and the value would remain behind unless it came through SU24. And so that's, again, just scratching on the surface, but SU24, incredibly important. And if you haven't maintained it yet, this is the opportunity to do so. And then, update, streamline, redesign, design, whatever you have to do to get your security up to par. And also don't forget about your GRC rule set. Obviously, when you start building roles and moving roles and migrating roles to S4, ideally, you want to build clean, meaning SOD-free single roles. And you can only do that if you have a GRC system and a corresponding rule set that has been updated for S4 to check your roles against that. So do that before. The good news is updating the GRC rule set is significantly easier than updating all your roles, but that's a task that you want to preload to your migration project. And then obviously use automation tools if possible. Doesn't really matter if it's ours or someone else's, but we'll show you a couple of demos here now on how you can do that using some of our automation capabilities. And we call it the XAMS, or the Exciting Authorizations Management Suite. And so one of the first things that we often do is when we embark on a migration project, we analyze the current role. So in this case here, I've selected, there is a selection area here on the upper left, a number of finance roles that I want to scan for compatibility with S4. And what the report basically tells me is that in all of these roles, I don't know why it's 11 in every single case, it must be a coincidence, a bad demo selection here, but basically I see that there are 11 objects in all of these roles that are obsolete, meaning they don't exist anymore in S4. And I have 6 objects that I would have to introduce, potentially to replace some of the obsolete ones, to make those roles S4 compatible. And the underlying intelligence or data behind this report is really SAP Simplification List that shows you, okay, instead of FD03, you now need BP. So that's basically, some poor fella in our team, I guess, had to type all that up and put it into the application. But that's basically what it is. Fairly straightforward, but incredibly useful. And you can then double click on the details and you would see, okay, here is FD03, doesn't exist anymore. BP is the replacement. In some cases, there might not be a replacement, but in our example here, we have a replacement for every single one. We also have a little info button. If you're not tired of reading the simplification list yet, you can click on that and you see more details in terms of OSS notes that explain maybe some details around that simplification. So you can continue reading and basically understand why we are proposing this change to your roles. Then I've talked about SU24 already. Here is just a quick report that shows you some of the capabilities of what that means to optimize and update SU24. This example here is around table access. So we have here a number of transactions, regardless if they are custom, like the Z transactions or standard transactions, that are part of numerous roles here, it looks like, in our system. And these transactions provide access to certain tables. And of course, if you authorize someone for table access, you want to protect that table access and you want to have that properly proposed through SU24, either through the table group. So you want to protect the whole table group. It's called S tabu dis, or the table name, S tabu nam. And if either one is red or has an empty or incorrect value, then that's an indication for you, the security admin, or for someone else who does security, to decide which of those two should be added to SU24. If nothing else, then the table group for sure, but in some cases it might make more sense to add the table name. And based on some of the comments in SAP source code, we've gotten an indication that SAP might change the way the kernel does authority checks, because today, if you access a table, it first checks if you're authorized for the table group, and then it checks for the table name. Going forward, SAP might do away with checking for S tabu dis entirely and go right to S tabu nam, the table name. So that's something to keep into account, or to take into account and to consider when updating your SU24. And all of the other reports in a very similar fashion, you walk through them, you bring SU24 up to speed and up to, you optimize it basically as best as you possibly can. So then when you start building roles, you get all the proposals in, and you don't have to insert a lot of stuff manually, which makes your roles less maintainable, less transparent, etc., etc. And once we've done that, and this was obviously like fast forward, there are a couple of other minor steps in between, but once we've done all of that, once we've done the analysis, the SU24 update in the first wave, we start then designing roles. And designing roles could mean we either just update your existing ones if they're in good shape, or we design roles from scratch. And what we do usually is we import your existing roles, because one of the things that we are interested in is finding out how your current roles compare with usage data. And by usage data, I mean, for instance, STO3N. STO3N is a trace in your system that maintains that usage data. It basically tells you what user has executed what transaction and when. And so depending on how much data you retain in your system, and that's a configuration option, we scoop up that data, and then we maybe wait a little longer, scoop up more, with the goal to have about 4 months worth of data, because that allows us to say, okay, what have users done in the past 4 months, and how does that compare with their current roles? If we see that users are overly authorized, if they have 500 transactions but only have used 20, that's a pretty good indication that we can maybe streamline some of that, as part of that migration project, and maybe even positively impact your licensing, which is a completely separate subject and presentation. And then, of course, we take the S4 data model into account. Again, that's going back to that simplification list. And we pipe everything into a virtual role design cockpit we call the role designer. And here is an animated GIF that shows you kind of how it works. On the left-hand side, grouped by user, we see all the transactions or your usage data. Basically, we can see that my friendly boss A Banzer here has used a number of transactions. In the middle, we can see roles that we've either imported from the system or that we can create from scratch. Now, the important thing is any roles we create in here in this cockpit is virtual at first. It doesn't exist in PFCG yet. What it allows us to do, however, is it allows us to create roles by simply drag and dropping either individual T codes or groups of T codes, and then drag and dropping them onto our users. And the advantage of that approach is that on the very right-hand side, we see the coverage percentage. So we get an immediate live comparison of how a role covers a user based on that user's usage data. So based on all the transactions that I've used, if I were to assign this role, how would that cover my user? Am I covered 100%, 150, or only 60%? So that allows us to build a role concept before we start the migration, based on the least privilege principle, basically. So bottom up, that significantly reduces the risk of A, over authorizing users, and B, introducing SOD conflicts. And so that's kind of how the role design part works. And once we are done with that, we can go ahead and scan those virtual roles that might not even exist in the system yet against SOD conflicts. And of course, at that point, we need a rule set that has been updated for S4 already. And if you have that, we can reach out to SAP Access Control or GRC. If you don't, we have a built-in rule set as well. We call the XIMS critical functions. And so either or basically works. You can scan those roles. You can remove any SOD conflicts. You can separate roles out if need be, or do different assignments. And once you're done with that, once you're happy with your design overall, we can go ahead and migrate those roles to S4. And here we are back into the role designer. The screenshot looks a little different because I took it on my Mac and the previous one was a Windows-based screenshot. But it's exactly the same application with our transactions on the left, the roles in the middle, and the users on the right. We load the migration data. We select the version of S4 that we want to migrate to. So we have different transports for 17, 1809, etc. 1909 coming out soon. Well, it is September already. And so you can load that simplification list. We give you again an indication of what's going to change and what we have to change to make those roles S4 compatible. And then we do it. Once you push a button, we remove anything that's obsolete and does not have a replacement. We replace everything that can be replaced, and that includes the backend Fiori app authorizations. And then we give you an idea of, okay, this is what we've done. We've adjusted the objects. We have deleted certain objects. We have also updated the usage data. That's useful because then if you, going forward, want to build new roles for S4, you would already see the S4 objects in your old usage data. So if a user had used FD03 in the past, you would now see BP in the usage data, even though obviously that user has never used BP because it's a new system and a new transaction. But that helps you to build then S4 compatible roles from the get-go instead of having to go through that migration again, which only takes a few seconds, but still. Now, one of the critical parts of every redesign is testing, role testing, right? And so what we have done is we've automated that process, and there are two different test scenarios that I want to walk you through really quick. I know we are getting 15 minutes towards the end of that session here, but let's talk about a scenario where you decide to redesign your roles before you embark on the S4 migration. So we've done, everything you've seen so far. We've redesigned roles, we've cleaned them up, we've done SU24, et cetera, et cetera. Now it's time for testing. And testing typically means involving the business, writing test script, setting up test environment. It's incredibly time consuming, has an impact on your business, and nobody wants to do that, which is one of the reasons, I suppose, why nobody wants to do a redesign. However, we've built capability that can automate that process. So let's assume we are in a production system. And I know if I say production and testing in the same sentence, you might think I'm crazy, but bear with me, I'm not, at least not to my knowledge. And I'll tell you exactly how it works and why that makes sense. So let's assume we have a dialog user, and that dialog user in production has a set of old roles, right? And we've designed new roles for that user, and now we want to find out how good are those roles, what's missing. We basically want to go through a test cycle without having to go through a test cycle. The way we do that is we create a standard SAP reference user in production. We assign that reference user to the dialog user, and we assign the new roles that we have designed or redesigned to the reference user, okay? So practically, the dialog user is working in production without knowing what's going on with the current set of roles and with the new roles in the backpack or indirectly assigned via the reference user. And the reason why we do this is because when the SAP kernel performs an authority check, it always does it against the reference user first. And if that fails, it goes against the dialog user and tries again. And this is a completely transparent process. That initial potential failure against the reference user, the user doesn't even notice. But what we get, if it fails here on the reference user and succeeds on the dialog user, we get a return code 0. So 0 is an indication for us we have a gap or something missing in our new roles that the user is currently authorized for. And we can look at the report and we see exactly what it is. Is it the object? Is it the field? Is it a value, org field, org value, what have you? We see exactly what the gap is. We can take this information back to our dev system. We fix the role, we transport it up to production. And as we do this, at some point, we'll no longer see any more return code 0s. And nobody has done any testing. Nobody was impacted. We just relied on the daily activity of your users in production to simulate the gaps in our new roles. Now, obviously, if we have a reference production ECC system, that's fairly easy because we can do exactly what I've just told you. In the case of S4, we don't have a production S4 system because we are just migrating to S4, and we might have a queue system or what have you, but nothing in production yet. So we cannot quite do it that way. However, SAP was kind enough to create a new role or to allow us to generate one that's called SAP_app. It's like SAP all, but it's not really SAP all, it's just SAP app, indicating that a user with that role can pretty much execute every application. And that's a tremendous help for our testing because we can go through exactly the same thing in a non-prod S4 QA system, let's say. And instead of assuming the user has currently roles assigned, we assign that SAP app, right? Which allows the user or the tester in this particular case to run through the test script, and we still get the benefit of A, the tester never gets stuck because of the SAP app, and B, we can do a gap analysis with our new roles and we can find out exactly what is missing here that prevents us from going live. And this is a tremendous time saver, obviously, and so we go through all of this maybe first in ECC before, if we decide to do a redesign before. If we do it as part of the S4 migration, we would go through this as part of the S4 migration, and then we are done. And that's our test automation basically that we've built into, and here you see the name, the Xiting Authorizations Management Suite, or XIMS. SAP has found that solution so cool that they have endorsed it in an OSS note specifically around the use case of technical RFC users, because there you have the very same issue if you have a SAP all that you have assigned to your RFCs, because it works, but obviously from a security perspective is not so great. Then you can use exactly this capability to redesign your RFC users risk-free. Now, some of the lessons that we've learned before we conclude the session here and open it up to questions. The simplification list is incomplete, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just the nature of the beast. It's a living document, gets updated all the time, but assume that whatever version you have that matches a certain version of S4, there might still be things missing. For example, if you have display roles for BP, you still need to add XK03 and XD03 to those roles, because they're being checked even though those transactions don't even exist anymore on S4. So that's kind of a funny thing. There are also authorization objects that are still being checked, and that's not necessarily clear from the simplification list. And really unrelated to those two gaps or funny behavior, SU24 update is definitely required, both on the source as well as then on a target, meaning S4 system. Bottom line is, you will have to do some security work, be it designing new roles or redesigning them or optimizing them or lift and shifting them. It doesn't really matter. You have to do some security work, and there are plenty of opportunities to automate that, especially when it comes to testing, but also just the mechanics of lifting and shifting. If you use automation tools, you're obviously going to be quicker and it's going to cost you less money. That's kind of a no-brainer. When you make changes to your authorizations, take licensing into account. I've mentioned it briefly before. Make sure that you fully understand how SAP intends to measure licenses going forward. Is it usage-based? Is it authorization-based? There is conflicting information out there, and SAP has made conflicting statements. So make sure with your account rep you fully understand how they do it in your particular case, and take GDPR compliance into account if you have data of European citizens in your SAP system, because at some point someone might ask you, who has access to GDPR data within your organization? And then you have to look at authorization objects that provide access to that data and see who is that assigned via roles, etc. So it's a transparency issue, and you want to take that into account as well whenever you make changes. The bottom line really is that S4 is an exciting new platform that comes with changes and challenges, as so often the case. It introduces an entirely new data model, which makes changes to your security necessary. To what extent really depends on the shape of your security today. Likely case scenarios that you're going to end up doing a partial redesign, if not more. With the XIMS, you can obviously simplify and automate some of those time-consuming tasks, and save time and money in the process. The key takeaway really is make sure that security is not forgotten. If your business leadership, is all excited about S4 and wants to jump on the bandwagon, tomorrow or yesterday, make sure that you as a security person or someone who does security has a say and has a seat on the table, basically. And don't forget about your GRC rule set. Very simple to update in comparison to everything else, but something that you ideally want to do before you start your migration journey. There are 2 links, and everyone gets a copy of the slide deck, by the way, so you'll have those links in there as well. But if you're interested in how to maintain business roles for Fiori Launchpad, there is an SCN blog that leads to some reports that you can import that can help with that. And then also BW on S4. There is a good article here from a British gentleman that you can read and better understand what the impact on your BW might be. And with that, we can open it up to questions. And Alessandro, since you've been so kindly monitoring the questions box, I'll let you read them out and answer them, if you would be so kind.
There were a lot of questions, so I think you were very confusing here, I think. No, I'm just kidding. There's a couple of questions. There were a couple of questions regarding training courses like ADM 945. Just very briefly, and we'll send out, as Michael said initially, we'll send out the answers following the webinar. ADM 945, that's a very good training when it comes to Fiori authorizations. The training title is a little bit misleading. It says S/4HANA or authorization concepts in S/4HANA. It is mainly about Fiori. So if you're interested in learning about Fiori, then ADM 945 will be the right course. There's other trainings available for S/4HANA migrations. I have to check the status. They're available in Europe. I'm not sure if they brought it over to the US yet, but we'll include it in the follow-up email. There were a couple of other questions, Michael. Yeah, whether there's a GRC rule set delivered for S/4HANA from SAP. Yes, there is. If you're on access control 10.1 or on 12.0. On 10.1, I think it's delivered with support package 19. That contains a BC set that can be implemented. That contains S/4HANA transactions and also Fiori authorizations. Couple of other questions, where we can find the simplification list. Straightforward, just go to Google and Google SAP S/4HANA simplification list with your release, that is 1810, 1709, 1809, and so on, and you will find it.
We'll also include a link then in the email.
Yeah, that as well. What else? Yeah, there was a question regarding the SAP app role that we can create through SU25. So the SAP app role is not a SAP all or a SAP new. SAP app should only include application authorizations that are required for our end users. So basically, if a user gets access to a customer master transaction, that should only contain the customer master authorizations and so on. So it's not basis authorizations like SC16 and all the dangerous stuff. It's really only for applications for our end users. And I apologize if you can hear my son. He always goes nuts if I'm talking, even though he's outside my office. What else, Michael? Did you have a look? There's a lot of questions.
I have honestly have not looked at the questions box yet, but I saw you answered many of them. So
yeah, there were a lot. So there was a question regarding transactions that security administrators use today, like ST Austrace, PFCG, SU01, and so on. The good news is SAP S/4HANA is still an ABAP system. So for us security admins, it's still the same tools. We still have SU01 to maintain users. We still have PFCG to build roles. We have all the tracing capabilities with ST Austrace, ST USOB trace, the ST user trace, ST RFC trace. We have SU25, we have SU24, as Michael mentioned. So it doesn't really change. From a security perspective, we still have the same tools available. For S/4HANA itself, it's the same as we did as we used to do it in ECC. The only change is really when we implement Fiori, because then we have to deal with front-end and back-end authorizations. We have to create catalogs on the Fiori Launchpad Designer that are required. So it's technical catalogs that we can create. We can either use SAP standards, we can create our custom ones, and those we have to authorize in our PFCG roles on the front end, but also on the backend server. When I say front and backend server, there's different scenarios how we can deploy Fiori. We can have front and backend in one server, basically, where we can also have one PFCG roles that supports the front end and the backend authorizations. That doesn't have to be split. It was recommended. SAP changed the recommendation as well. Now it's more a integrated approach that's recommended. I would say that's the only real change we have when in S/4HANA is when we use Fiori, because then we have to deal with the OData services that we have to authorize for the applications, and also the technical catalogs in PFCG. And that's very well explained in the training, ADM 945. That's the perfect training for that, where we learn to build catalogs, technical catalogs, how we authorize those in PFCG, and so on. And also for the Fiori applications, Michael mentioned it, even for the, we have to authorize Fiori, basically the OData services. We can also supplement the SU24 values for those OData services. It's the same approach. We can add the OData services through the role menu. and then in the authorization tab of the role, we will get the proposals from SU24. That's also important because then we have the reference back in the role. When we look into the role, why we have certain authorizations added to the role, we have the reference or the where used list of what brought the authorizations in. So also there, for transparency reasons and stability reasons of the roles, I would say very, very important that we also optimize and use SU24 for the Fiori applications. We got a few minutes.
Michael, go ahead.
Hello?
Can you hear me, Michael?
Something is very loud now.
Mike, can you hear it loud and clear?
I think something is off with the audio. Let me mute it for a second.
Okay.
Oh, that sounds better. There was one question regarding licensing. So SAP has announced a while ago that they might change the way they measure licenses. Instead of doing usage, doing access-based. So if you have users that have transactions or authorizations assigned, even though they never use them, but that might put them into a different licensing tier, then you might be on the hook for paying extra license revenue or license fees to SAP. And so a redesign makes sense from that perspective to really streamline the access and make sure nobody has more than what they truly need. And is that a true statement? Well, that's what we've heard. We've also heard that SAP has backpedaled a little bit and changed that. I don't know. And it all depends on your individual contract, unfortunately. So there is no, one answer fits all kind of thing. But that's why I've mentioned before, ask about how licenses are going to be, or licensing is going to be measured going forward. And if it's access-based, make sure you have proper access, meaning a proper role design. And if not, take that as an opportunity to redesign it. And it basically pays for itself, because if you don't, you might be on the hook for additional license fees to SAP, and that can be potentially a lot of money. And so yes, that is a statement we've heard as well at the German SAP annual conference 2 years ago, and I assume it's still the case. So let's see what else we got. Where can I find more information on SU24? Very good question. So one of our more technical persons from Europe has written up I think a series of 10 blog articles that talks about everything SU24, more than what you ever wanted to know about SU24. I'll include a link to that blog series in our follow-up email, so you can read that. It's very technical, just to be warned, but it has really everything you need to know about SU24 and how to properly leverage that. And I think, Alessandro, is it safe to unmute you again? Let me try. Hello?
Can you hear me, Mike?
Now you're distorted. Not sure what's happening.
I don't know either.
Oh no, now it works. Okay. Don't do anything. Don't change anything.
I wasn't even touching my computer. No, I think that's it. I mean, there's a couple of other questions. We probably have to look into them more closely, and we'll answer them through the email.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds good. Well, we are actually right at 2:30, so thank you very much, everyone, for attending and for sticking with us for an hour of your life today. We appreciate it, as always. We'll send out follow-up emails with all the additional information, with links to the recordings, etc. And if you have any questions, just shoot us an email. I'd be more than happy to, jump on a call with you and discuss anything else that we haven't covered today. And if you're at TechEd next week, stop by our booth. We'll be there the whole week. We also have a couple of sessions about what do we have, SAP hacking, GDPR, and whatnot. I don't know, all security, all good stuff. So stop by, and we'll hopefully meet you there. Thank you. Bye-bye.